All right. Hey guys. So welcome to Online APUSH. And so we're just going to restart this frame so that we have everything in really nice small chunks. All right. So we're going to continue with Eisenhower's domestic policy. And remember, the thing that I taught you guys was that Eisenhower's policies were often, especially economically, were often balanced, moderate, very prosperous. We are seeing the rise of the middle class, but also a growth economically. On the more liberal side, Eisenhower is going to employ Keynesian economics, which of course means that government will intervene in the economy. However, the Eisenhower administration will also, and this is more conservative, will not intrude directly into the private sector. So there is a difference. He will intrude into the economy without intruding into businesses. All right. As we said last week, we got back on the escalator of prosperity. Paul Samuelson's economics textbook basically kind of outlined that government intervention uh, could create a situation in which governments can maintain permanent prosperity within a country's economy. So remember, this is going to be different from the 1920s because in the 1920s, the escalator was dependent upon laissez faire economics, whereas the 1950s escalator prosperity relied on government intervention into the economy. Eisenhower did test um, whether Keynesian economics could work in 1953 when there was a slight slump in the economy. His Secretary of Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board are going to make credit much easier to get, as well as increase the flow of currency. And the result was that the economy recovered very quickly. Another slump happened in 1957. Eisenhower's administration did nothing, and the recession lasted for over a year. So, like I said, his Eisenhower's policies were also very conservative with regard to business. He did not intrude into business. Corporate consolidation was the result. By the end of the 1950s, half of the net corporate income was going to about 600 firms, or 1/10 of 1% of total number of corporations. So this basically means that we're seeing a lot of increases in the number of monopolies, right? Wealth, yes, concentrating in at the top, but at the same time, realize we are seeing the growth of a middle class. So, in addition to businesses consolidating, we're also going to see labor unions consolidating. So, the AFL CIO is going to merge. You may recall the AFL organized only skilled labor and the CIO only organized unskilled labor. Well, these two are going to merge in 1955, and we're seeing essentially labor unions becoming big business. And because they became so big, just like in the business world, uh, when you get to be that big, there's going to be some level of corruption. The example I'm going to use is the Teamsters Union. So this was another labor union, national labor union, that uh, often had allegations of corruption, starting with David Beck and then moving on to now the infamous Jimmy Hoffa. So Jimmy Hoffa was finally pursued by federal agents um, for basically misappropriating a lot of union funds, and so they got him on tax evasion. He served time, and he's going to disappear shortly after coming out of prison. And there are allegations that the mafia silenced him. Again, his dealings with corrupt organizations. So Eisenhower, now we're going to flip to back to Eisenhower's very liberal policies. He's going to enact one of the biggest public works programs in the history of the United States with the Federal Highway Act of 1956. And this basically started the interstate highway system in the United States, linking major cities. 42,000 miles of interstate highway was constructed, of course, creating jobs and at the same time confirming our commitment towards the automobile as opposed to public transportation. So now we're going to go, another big topic under the Eisenhower's administration is domestic um, in his domestic policy was the civil rights movement. We all, of course, know in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, that of course set um, the law at being separate but equal, even if it wasn't so equal. So, of course, in 1954, Brown versus Board is going to be ruled at the Supreme Court level, and this is going to overturn Plessy versus Board. Now, because states were the entity responsible for public education, um, states generally did not comply with the ruling in 1954. So a year later, the Supreme Court came back and said that desegregating public schools needs to be done with all deliberate speed. And many of the northern states did, but not the southern states. As a matter of fact, a lot of the southern states are going to not just be complacent in terms of just not doing it, they're going to protest against Brown versus Board. It's called massive resistance. So this was active and often violent protesting by Southern whites against the integration of public schools. And examples of how school boards and school systems would find ways and loopholes around Brown versus Board was through pupil placement laws. This is basically laws put on the books at the school board level that basically allowed the school board officials to place students in respective schools. So, for example, smart kids would go to one school, not so smart kids would go to other schools. And of course, smart being code for white. Um, and this is how we continued to have segregation in the public schools in the 1950s. Now, of course, this is going to be brought up before the Supreme Court in Shuttlesworth versus Birmingham Board of Education. And the ruling of the court in 1958 was to refuse to declare these pupil placement laws unconstitutional. So they remained on the books for decades. Launching the civil rights movement in terms of protest, a lot of historians will point to Emmett Till. He was a young African American boy from Chicago who came down south one summer to stay with relatives. Um, and there was an incident that took place in this little southern town, and he allegedly went to the parking lot of a grocery store and spoke to a white woman who which at the time was really not considered to be something that you did um, because of all the public segregation that was taking place. But allegedly, he whistled at her and said some crude things. And then that night, the woman goes home, tells her husband and brother-in-law, who then went and sought out Emmett Till from his uncle's home, beat him, shot him, tied his body to a cotton gin fan, and then dumped his body in the river. There was the local authorities did prosecute. However, an all-white jury did find the men innocent. Later, the two men sold their story to a publisher and wrote a book about how they killed Emmett Till. Speaking of the woman who accused Emmett Till, on her deathbed, she did retract, uh, saying that that incident never really happened. All right. So Emmett Till's body um, is going to be displayed at his funeral, and this is going to be done by his mother, who essentially wanted the world to see what these men had done to her little boy. So it is considered to be one of the launching points for the civil rights movement. Following closely behind is going to be the Montgomery bus boycott, started essentially by Rosa Parks. She was a 42-year-old African American woman who was a frequent flyer on the Montgomery bus public transportation system. And at the time, Montgomery segregated buses, meaning that the front of the bus was reserved for whites, the back of the bus was reserved for African Americans. So One day, Parks decided that since the bus was empty, she was just going to sit up front. When a white passenger got on board, the bus driver told her she had to go to the back. She refused, and Parks was arrested and charged $10 for violating segregation laws in Montgomery. Um, at that point, uh, Martin Luther King stepped in. At the time, he was not well known. He was not the icon that he will become. He was a reverend at a local African American church, and he was a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a group of reverends who kind of wanted to become more political. So he got involved in organizing a boycott, meaning that people would protest by not riding the Montgomery bus system. Over the next year, 50,000 African Americans boycotted the city bus system, choosing to walk, ride bicycles, or carpool instead. The result of the boycott was that the bus company refused to change its policies. So finally in 1956 the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was not constitutional, and the Montgomery city government ended segregation policies. So the Montgomery bus boycott essentially elevated Martin Luther King into national prominence, and he's going to continue to work under the Southern Christian Leadership Conference um, to uh, to protest against segregation, protest in favor of African Americans' civil rights, using nonviolent civil disobedience. So uh, the brilliance of Martin Luther King is that he's going to use media coverage to his advantage. He knew that when protesters would go peacefully protesting, that they would be met with violence. And of course, anything that is um, outrageous is going to be covered by the media. So many of these protests, especially when police and other local officials became violent, it was televised, and it portrayed police and other um, organizations trying to stop the protest in a negative light, while the peaceful protesters were not retaliating. And this is going to lead to mass public sympathy for civil rights movement. And again, that was the intention of Martin Luther King, to essentially make the peaceful protests, the good guys and police and other organizations trying to stop the protests using violence, the bad guys. All right, so as I said before, local schools in the South just did not integrate. So one of the examples of this is in Arkansas. In the state's capital, Little Rock, there was a high school called Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the uh, the local civil rights activist group had targeted essentially Central High School and attempted to try and get any volunteers within the African American community to to attend this all-white school. And it was difficult because if you did volunteer, not only were you going to be targeted by various groups, and I don't mean just hate groups, just targeted by white America, who was very fearful of integration. Not only would you get targeted as the student, but your whole family would get essentially targeted, blacklisted, and harassed. So they did find 9 volunteers. They were often referred to as the Little Rock Nine, and they're going to register to go to Central High School. Now, of course, the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Faubus, he felt that enforcing integration would create chaos, so he ordered the Arkansas National Guard, these are, of course, state militia, to go to Central High School, and instructed the National Guard to turn away the Little Rock Nine. All right. So, of course, there's going to be a lot of violence on campus. Massive resistance is going to be the effect of the attempt to integrate the Little Rock Nine. And because violence was starting to erupt on the campus of Central High School, angry mobs of protesters joined the National Guard in intimidating these African American students. Eisenhower steps in because he viewed the actions of the governor, that's Faubus, was challenging the Constitution and challenging the president's authority as the leader of executing the law of the land. So Eisenhower sent federal troops down to Central High School and placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal command, and then instructed them to stand down and allow the U.S. soldiers to escort the Little Rock Nine to class daily. And that is how Central High School essentially began its process of integration. All right, so speaking of civil rights, Eisenhower will sign into law two pieces of legislation that are essentially going to be um, that's going to lack any real enforcement. But this is the first attempt at any kind of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And the first is the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And this created the United States Civil Rights Commission to investigate and report voter discrimination. It did give the Attorney General the power to require federal courts to issue orders to prevent any interference with a person's right to vote. The problem with this legislation is that it didn't have any real accountability or mechanism for enforcement, so it was largely ignored. As a result of its ineffectiveness, the Civil Rights Act of 1960 was passed. This created federal voting referees, federal being the operative word here, to go to local voting polls and voting locations to referee, to help correct conditions that prevented voters from voting. Again, this one's not going to have a whole lot of teeth in it either. And at that point, because of the ineffectiveness of these two pieces of legislation, there's going to be the idea of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that is going to start to be considered uh, because these two pieces of legislation were ineffective. All right, last but not least, let's go back to how the arms race and space race are going to affect the United States domestically. So, last we left, the Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, and then we followed that up with detonating our um, our hydrogen bomb. But then the Russians finally have a major win. The Soviets will launch a satellite named Sputnik in 1957. And so the Russians essentially beat the Americans to space. They had what appeared to be the technical edge over Americans. So, what was Sputnik? It was basically a 2 foot um, ball, metal ball that weighed about 184 pounds, and it had some antennas that kind of projected off the ball. And all it would do was send a signal in space back to ground control. So it would just go ping, 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 and then at the ground level, you could hear it. Well, Russians who were listening to the radio signal could hear it. So it was launched in 1957. It stayed in orbit for 92 days, and then kind of just fell out of the sky. And because of that, Americans were freaked out again that it seems like the Russians were smarter than us, the Russians were doing better than us, and in our attempt to try and catch up with the Russians, Congress passes the National Defense Education Act, which gave funding to high school instruction in math, science, and foreign language. So basically, putting money at the federal level into the STEM fields. It also created the Advanced Placement Program. to help the US catch up with the Soviets. So you guys are sitting remotely in an AP class because of Sputnik. All right, I had mentioned these duck and cover drills, but essentially schools were reacting, much like our school has reacted to Corona, by instituting duck and cover drills. And so this was basically, what do you do in case of a nuclear attack? So you basically duck and you cover, right? People started building bomb shelters. Doomsdayers started stocking up on things, I'm sure, that included toilet paper. And so we see an escalation not only of a concern over a nuclear attack, but we're also going to see the number of atomic testings increase. Between July 1945 and September 1992, the U.S. conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests. And you might say, well, where did they test 1,000 bombs? Um, Usually in the Nevada test sites, but also in the islands of the South Pacific. Um, so here are some of the major islands that we detonated nuclear bombs. They were usually in atolls, ATOLL. These were like islands with essentially these sinkholes in the center. And here in those white boxes are the various locations that we had detonated nuclear bombs. All right, so NASA is also going to be a little freaked out because it seems like the Russians have beat us. And then, that beating continued. So not only did the Soviets get the first beat us essentially to space, but they also got the first man in space. So in 1961, the Soviets are going to launch their Vostok program, in which they get the first human in space. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he was a Russian cosmonaut. That's him right there. And he's going to be the first person in space. Got him back alive. And of course, again, Americans are freaked out. But if you look at this timeline, you're going to see that we really weren't behind. It's just that we had more safety features in place. So, we weren't as reckless as perhaps the Russians were. So even though they got Sputnik up into space by October 1957, October, November, December, January, 3 months later, we did the same thing, sent a satellite into space. And yes, they may have gotten the first man in space, but look, 1 month later, or rather, where is it? Yeah, 1 month later, we're going to do the same thing with the Mercury program, sending Alan Shepard into space. And that's Yuri, and here's Alan. All right, so because there was such concern about all of this nuclear testing, we signed in 1963 a limited test ban treaty. It banned all above ground testing because there was a concern we were putting a lot of radiation into the atmosphere. Not only were we doing this, but the Russians were doing it as well. So technology then started to change a little bit. To spy on the Russians, we created the Shoal Desert Research Institute in Sand Springs Mountain, Nevada. And it was an underground test site. And not only did we start detonating bombs underground, but we started to do testing on if we could tell if there was a difference between a nuclear bomb and, say, an earthquake. So we would use the seismograph that they would use to measure earthquakes, and we would detonate bombs and then see if it registered on the Richter scale. And if there was a difference, if we could tell if there was a difference between the shaking of the earth by an earthquake or the shaking of the earth by a nuclear bomb, so that we can essentially figure out how many bombs the Russians are detonating. All right, so here is the detonation of an atomic bomb at the Nevada facility. And the end. All right, I'll stop the video here. We'll continue tomorrow.